Okay, this one's gonna be narrowed down a little bit given the feedback I've been getting from you guys. So today we're talking about all things spotted bay bass. I know this is kind of a small topic, but I think it's an important one to make given what I grew up doing and my knowledge on the topic. I'm gonna keep this one super basic and probably add to it down the line, but we're really just gonna talk about different types of structure and the baits I like to fish on said structure. And I'll dive into a little bit about how and why I like to fish those specific baits in each area. To start off, you really only have 3 different types of structure when you're targeting spotted bay bass. You're gonna have eelgrass flats, you're gonna have rocks, and you're gonna have docks and pilings. And typically I like to approach each one of those in a completely different way. So typically in your south harbors, like San Diego, Mission Bay, some of the lagoons down there, and all the harbors down south are gonna have mainly big eelgrass flats. Like, yeah, they have some dock structure, there's a little bit of rocks, but 90% of the fishing you're doing out there is on big stretches of eelgrass flats. So you have to cover a lot of water, and there's a lot less targeting specific areas than there is just covering a lot of water and trying to find the spots with the right condition. So typically when I'm fishing these big eelgrass flats, I like to fish fast moving baits. At least the logic in my head tells me if you're throwing something small that's swimming on the bottom, you're almost wasting a lot of time because your bait is only covering 2 or 3 feet on each side as you swim it slowly on the bottom through this giant, vast eelgrass flat. Whereas if you fish something a little bit higher up in the water column that's fast moving and gets a reaction bite, you can pull fish from 15, 20 feet away on those flats, and you can cover water a lot quicker and find zones with biting fish. So that being said, whenever I'm fishing vast eelgrass flats, there's really only 3 baits that I even bother bringing with me in the boat. Bait number 1 is gonna be a crankbait or a deep diving jerk bait. These baits make tons of noise, they're super obnoxious, and they're super easy to see from far away. When you rip this by some fish, they're gonna be pissed, they're gonna come up and they're gonna smack it. This is the number 1 bait that I like to fish over eelgrass just because you can cover water so fast and draw fish in from so far away. The biggest thing to think about with these is how deep they go. If you're fishing 10 feet of water, you're probably gonna wanna fish something that's running 7 or 8 feet. So I like to have a box full of baits that dive at different ranges, starting off at like 4 to 6 feet, like this Demiki Abyss 90, all the way down to 12 to 15 feet, like this Megabass Deep 6. Now, the number 1 question I always get about fishing these baits in the eelgrass is why would you fish a treble hook bait over soft grass? Is it not just gonna get wrapped up in the treble hooks? And that's why picking a bait that dives the right distance is key. You don't want the bait slamming down into the grass, hitting you don't really want the bait touching the bottom at all, to be honest. So hypothetically, if you have, this is the bottom, this is the surface of the water, and you have all your eelgrass right here, right? What you want your bait to do is run right above the eelgrass like this. So it's just barely ticking the tops of those grass blades. And you can feel when you're cranking down, if you're winding and you immediately crank right down and get mushed up in the grass, you know you're fishing a bait that's diving too deep. If you never ever touch the bottom or feel any grass, you know you're fishing a bait that's too shallow. You want a bait that just every now and then catches a blade of grass or two. Because the way those fish are sitting in the grass, they're posted there looking up, waiting for something to swim over the top of their head. And if your bait is slamming down into the grass, it's either gonna spook them or it's just gonna be gummed up with grass and it's not gonna get bit. And if you're way too far off the bottom, they're not gonna be comfortable enough to swim that far up. So you want it just a foot or so above the top of the grass. That way it's in the perfect depth for fish to see it from a long ways and be able to get up and go chase it. So having a wide range of different diving baits is key. Another huge thing I look for when I'm fishing the grass flats is how clear the water is. Honestly, I'm looking for that everywhere, but on the grass flats especially, clear water will destroy the bite. I talked about this a little bit in the last video we did. When you're picking your lure and the water's super clear, you're gonna wanna go with something a little bit more translucent like this. It's gonna look a little natural. And if the water's dirtier, you can pick a color that's a little more aggressive and stands out a little darker. And there's really no key aspect that I'm looking for when I'm fishing these grass flats, other than a little bit of current potentially and water clarity. Like I said, clear water is the number 1 killer of fishing in the bay. If the water's too clear, there's kayakers and there's boats and there's people walking on the docks and the fish can see everything. There's birds standing on the bank and they can see it and they're not comfortable. They're line shy, they're not gonna bite in clear water. But you also don't want the water super, super dirty to where they can't see your bait from a distance. The perfect level of water clarity is somewhere in between 3 to 5, 3 to 6 feet of visibility. If you can find some water that's a little bit off color and kind of that seafoam green color, you're in the right zone. And as long as there's grass on the bottom and it's not just sandy, you're probably gonna get bit. The second bait I really like to fish over grass is gonna be the A-rig. The A-rig is a super, super, super effective search bait to just cover a ton of water and find fish. When you have those big flats, you're not gonna wanna sit there and drag a bait like we talked about. You're gonna wanna make a ton of casts and find the fish. I can't exactly explain why, but if there's 1.5 miles of open water grass flat, there's gonna be patches in it with tons of fish, and there's gonna be patches in it that are just dead water. So fishing a bait that moves really fast and that has a lot of drawing power makes it really easy to narrow down what areas of the grass flat are holding fish. Same exact thing as the crankbait. You don't want this touching the bottom, scraping up all the grass, but you also don't want it too far off the bottom to where they're not comfortable enough to come up and grab it. 1 to 3 feet above the grass is prime for this. Again, fish are gonna be able to see this from really, really far away. And if it's close enough to the grass and structure, they're gonna have no problem coming up and taking a bite out of it. Now, the #1 bait I believe you can possibly fish in the bay for spotted bay bass is gonna be the Demiki axe blade. This bait is the perfect little tiny snackable profile, but it also grabs a ton of attention with the vibration and the blade. This thing is super easy to fish. You just throw it out and retrieve it. And as long as you're keeping it in that perfect strike zone, 1 to 3 feet off the top of the grass, it's gonna get absolutely chewed. And this is another bait that you can just hook and wind all day and cover a ton of water with. Which when we're fishing those grass flats, that's exactly what we wanna do. A lot of the times what I'll do is I'll start off with the A-rig or the crankbait and I'll find a few bites. And if I find an area where I get bit 2 or 3 times, I'll switch over to the axe blade and you can sit there and make the same casts 15 times and catch one every single cast. For whatever reason, they're gonna be schooled up in a small area of grass, and this thing is absolutely too easy to eat and they just can't resist it. If I ever need to absolutely buy a bite and nothing else is working, the Demiki axe blade is pretty much the closest thing you can do to buying a bite. Okay, the next type of structure that you're gonna be fishing for spotted bay bass is gonna be docks. You got docks and pilings. There's really only one way I like to fish those. I don't really waste too much time. The #1 bait that I like to throw in the docks and pilings is gonna be a Demiki backdrop. Super simple to fish. You literally just flip it in every corner of the dock and next to every piling, let it hit the bottom and twitch it a couple times. If you don't get bit, wind up, flip in the next corner or next piling. The only real tip that I find to help get more bites is to look which way the current's going, if the tide's incoming or outgoing. So let's say we have a piling, right? Forgive my drawing, I know. So this is a piling and it's like connected to the dock over here, right? And this is the surface of the water. So your fish are gonna be down here, sitting on the bottom of the piling. Depending on which way the current's going, if the current's coming this way, the fish is gonna be sitting on the opposite side, waiting for bait to come past so he can pop up and grab it. Now, inverse, if the current's coming from this way, he's gonna be sitting on the opposite side of where the current's going because the bait's gonna be rushing past the current, and you can use the piling to hide himself while the bait comes past and he can pop out and grab it. So usually when I'm fishing, I like to cast on the opposite side. I found the backdrop to be pretty much the most effective bait to fish on pilings and stuff like that, but sometimes they want a slower falling lure. So in that case, I'll fish a leadhead swim bait like this, or you can fish a tube style bait. This one is custom, what's it called? Unique baits, but hookup baits or any tube like that is super effective for flipping docks and pilings too. That one's pretty self-explanatory, and probably the easiest way to catch spotties is just flip docks with pretty much any lure, let it hit the bottom, twitch it a couple times, wind it in. But I do find that the slow pitch backdrop style lures get bit the best just because they sink straight down, or if you get a good cast, they'll flutter backwards underneath the dock a little bit farther where the fish are kind of tucked away in the shade. Now, the biggest mistake I see people make when flipping docks is clicking their reel in right away. If the water's 10 feet deep and you flip into the dock and you click your reel into gear right away, it's not gonna sink straight down the piling like this and get bit where the fish is down here. If you click your reel in, the tension is gonna make your lure pendulum out and land on the bottom out here, nowhere near where the fish is down here on the bottom of the piling. So you wanna make sure that your lure is falling on a slack line so it can go straight down the piling with no resistance and end up right at the bottom. If you're fishing a bait caster and your tension knob is a little bit tight, that's enough tension to pull that lure away from the bottom of the piling and pretty much cut your bites in half, if not by more. The last style of structure you'll find in bays and harbors when targeting spotted bay bass is gonna be ripraps, rocks, boulders, rock piles, jetties, big underwater rocks type of deal. In this case, the fish are gonna kind of be tucked back into the caves, looking out into open water, waiting for something to swim by or a crab to crawl by on the rock. This is typically where I break out the low and slow crabby lures. 9 times out of 10, crabs aren't gonna be crawling around in eelgrass. You might find them every now and then, but it's more gonna be bait fish, ghost shrimp, fin bait style stuff, smaller, faster swimming baits. But on the big rocks and the jetties, there's gonna be a lot of baby lobster, there's gonna be a lot of crabs, there's gonna be a lot of little octopus and just junk that they're gonna be able to eat. So 9 times out of 10, when I'm fishing chunk rock, I'm opting for a crustacean style low and slow lure. You can also fish crankbaits and hardbaits on the rocks, but I tend to stay away from it just because they get snagged a lot. Personally, I prefer to fish hardbaits over grass just because you don't have to worry about snagging them. And if I fish hardbaits over the rocks, I'm gonna jump the leader up to like 40 pound because hardbaits are expensive. I don't like to lose them, but they do work if you can make a proper cast. But like I said, more often than not, I am opting for the crabby crustacean style lure, low and slow over the rocky structure. So that being said, that's pretty much what everybody that fishes spotted bay bass knows is a lead head swim bait, throw it out there and reel it back in slow, and it works really well. So what I typically like to do when I'm fishing long stretches of rocky shoreline, I like to do what I call stitching bottom, and that's basically making a long cast, letting your bait hit the bottom, and then doing 5 or 6 handle turns and pausing it. 5 or 6 handle turns and pausing it. And usually you're gonna get bit on the pause when your bait is penduluming back down to the bottom. So if this is the bottom, your bait's gonna be coming across as you retrieve, and then you're gonna stop and it's gonna hit the bottom. And then it's gonna be coming across as you retrieve, and you're gonna pause and it's gonna hit the bottom. And usually on that descent is when they'll come up and grab it. Now the reason for that pause is really just to keep it low and connected to the bottom so you know where the bottom is at all times. Because if you get too far away from the bottom, you're not gonna get any bites. A crab is not gonna be up swimming super fast through the water column. It's gonna be down near the rocks. And it's most vulnerable when it's a foot or two above the rocks, trying to get back down into a cave. If you want me to dive in a little bit deeper on any specific topic, let me know, and I can dive into crankbait fishing, I can dive into backdrop fishing, I can dive into A-rig fishing, I could dive into swim bait fishing. I would love to dive deeper on each one, but I like to start it off a little bit more general and see what people are curious about, and then I'll keep expanding on top of that topic. So if there's anything that I talked about in this video that you'd like to know more about or like me to dive deeper into, just let me know in the Q&A section and I'll start cooking on it. I'll also add some product links to some of my favorite baits and lures that I like to fish for spotties so you can get bit too. But that's pretty much the big gist of how I like to fish, and I think spotty fishing is super fun, and I think the great thing about spotty fishing is it's super accessible for everybody, and they pull hard and they bite hard and they eat cool lures. I'm gonna continue to kind of narrow down on each specific topic by species and by lure like this. So if there's anything specific outside of that you'd like to see, let me know. And other than that, we're gonna keep it cooking. Peace.